Well, good evening to everybody. On behalf of Best Life Brands, family of companies, ComForCare, At Your Side Home Care, and Care Control, we'd like to welcome all attendees from around the country and Canada to the live presentation, Grief in the Time of COVID. My name is Stephanie Wierzbicka. I am the Manager of Strategic Healthcare Programs here at the ComForCare headquarters, and I will be with you this evening. The purpose of this webinar is to serve as an opportunity to have a conversation around COVID. And we really wanted to take a deeper dive on how it impacts us all in terms of stress, grief, and caring from a distance. All these topics present unique challenges that we want to explore and talk about some helpful solutions. In this three-part conversational webinar series, the second topic we're going to address is grief in the time of COVID. This is a very difficult conversation to have for many, and even under normal circumstances, but COVID has left many of us dealing with grief in new ways, and because of it, can make it a really difficult process. So as your partner in care, we want to start the conversation and share some helpful information. Specifically, we're going to talk about how to understand grief and knowing that there are stages of grief, and how grieving during COVID has been compromised for many, but we'll also take a look at new paths of finding comfort and meaning during COVID. So before I go ahead and introduce you to our speaker, I want to take the opportunity to go through some housekeeping items. First, I want to let you know that this is about more or less a 30-minute presentation, and we will take time for question and answers towards the end of the webinar. Now, attendees are in listen-only mode, but we definitely want to encourage you to use the chat feature and Q&A. We will be monitoring it, and we're going to do our best to get to everyone's questions. But just know that you're here in good company and with fellow attendees that are probably going through similar situations just like you. So take advantage of just shooting in a little chat feature or pose a question and see what your fellow attendees can actually respond to and provide some insight, maybe some circumstances they've experienced and some solutions they've found to be helpful for them. Towards the end of this webinar, we will provide some tips on also how to manage the grieving process. We just simply want to start the conversation, but also leave you with some comfort and some support during this difficult time if any of you are going through that. Now, before I go ahead and introduce you to our presenter tonight, I want to go ahead and introduce you to the company that's hosting this educational event. Best Life Brands includes a suite of companies all focused on supporting exceptional senior care solutions. The first being ComForCare and At Your Side Home Care. We have the unique opportunity to assist families and seniors experience in-home care that helps them find meaning and purpose while keeping them safe at home. One of our greatest passions is to guide families and clients through their care journey that introduces caregivers into their lives who care like family. Secondly, Care Patrol's main focus is to assist families and individuals find the right senior care living options. They help families identify senior living options in their community and can facilitate the entire process from taking tours to moving in. And because of this, they build trust with their clients that is so important when making a true life transition. And now for our speakers. So as I mentioned, my name is Stephanie Wierzbicka, and I'm Manager of Strategic Healthcare Programs here at ComForCare. And I get the unique opportunity to develop programs that can help our clients live their best life possible. Over the past 16 years, I've learned that teaching and educating our communities like we are here tonight can make a big impact on improving health that I get an opportunity to be a part of that I'm truly grateful for. And our main speaker, who we are so excited to bring to you, Dr. Cynthia Green, is a clinical psychologist and cognitive wellness expert. She is the CEO of TBH Brands, parent company of Total Brain Health, a leading provider of brain fitness training products and services. She's a member of the Department of Psychiatry faculty at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine since 1990, and Dr. Green is the author of 6 books on brain health. She serves on the Industry Advisory Board of the International Council of Active Aging and the Optimizing Wellness Committee of the Dementia Action Alliance, and is a frequent media guest. Dr. Green, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. It's my absolute pleasure.
Terrific. So we all know that grief under normal circumstances is quite difficult, and during COVID, it has also really compounded the topic and what a lot of us are feeling and how we're able to process things. But I think it would be really helpful if we just at least begin by understanding what grief is. So could you give us a good understanding of just a definition of what grief is, so we can all kind of come to this webinar and presentation from sort of the same understanding of what it is?
Yes, I'm happy to. And I also just want to start out by saying, as we did last time, that, you know, these are very personal topics, and I think you kind of introduced that idea. And I want to also say that anyone who is joining us this evening should know that what we're talking about are ways that we're sharing information that we would hope would be helpful, but it is not in any way to diminish your own personal experience around any of these topics, and tonight around grief. And everyone has their own reaction to grief, and it's something that comes with a lot of nuance and differences depending on who we are and what the loss is to us. So, you know, just to put that out there, that this is offered in a way of being helpful and kind of explaining and maybe giving some resources for all of us, but in no way to take away from what your own experience might be. So from a psychological point of view, when it comes to understanding grief, we can think about grief as an emotional response to suffering in response to sorrow or to loss. And while we think of grief, and we're going to talk about grief tonight, primarily in terms of losing a loved one, and specifically during this difficult period of time around COVID, what you can also have a grief response to are things like a life transition. So changing, for example, your role. I was talking with some folks today who were saying many people are retiring right now, or they're being asked to retire, or they're losing their jobs because of difficulties in the economy. So that would be a life transition, for example, to which someone might have a grief reaction. We might have that in the loss of a role or a routine. Stephanie, at the top of the call before we got started, was talking about the kind of back and forth of having kids home and in school during this period of time, and how that shifts. And sometimes when they go back to school, the house is quiet. And we don't think about that at grief, but we can feel a little sad, right, at those times when we lose a routine or a role. But really, the loss of a loved one is what we think about when we think about grief and the grief process. And that's what we're going to focus on tonight.
Okay, terrific. That's very helpful. Now, we've all heard that there's different stages of grief. I've also heard that sometimes there isn't a specific order, and sometimes you might go from one stage to another. So can you help us understand, you know, what the process of grieving is like and why it's so important for us to understand that?
Yes. I think the most important thing about understanding grief is that it is in fact a process. And so it's not like it stops and it starts. And, you know, the process of grief kind of is different for all of us. And so we can commonly think of different stages, but this is a real kind of general idea of these stages of grief, and not something that everyone, as you said, experiences. Not you don't necessarily experience all the different stages, and you might not experience them in a particular order. But some common ways that people process grief might be to first feel a sense of denial, kind of a sense of shock that this has happened. This kind of idea that it doesn't feel real, for example. Being angry at the outcome, you know, that this loss has occurred. And that can be feeling angry externally or even internally, right? So anger at maybe resources, and certainly during COVID, we can maybe identify with that, a sense of feeling frustrated with available treatments, for example, or the fact that that people are put at such risk, or sometimes feeling angry with ourselves that maybe we feel like we missed something or didn't do something. Bargaining for a different outcome is a little funny because people don't really like that idea of like, I'm bargaining, but the sense that, you know, you're wishing something else had happened. Or thinking about another way of talking about that is, you know, thinking about what else might have been. And then of course, a feeling of sadness for some people that can be experienced really as depressed feelings in terms of not only feeling sad or blue, but having difficulty with sleep, or feeling more anxious, or feeling uninterested in things. And then finally, with that final stage of grief, psychologists think of that in terms of really a resolution of the grief. And it's not that the grief goes away. That's not what resolution means. Any of us who've lost a loved one know that it could be even 5 years later and something will happen. You could be at a major family event, for example, and feel a sense of grief at the person's absence, but more that it becomes woven into the fabric of your day-to-day life, that that individual is gone, that loss has occurred, and so that you begin to process it in a way that allows you to move forward.
And I think it's so important that, you know, we're talking about the stages, because most of us don't necessarily know that there are actual stages. And I think it's important that you go through all of them and allow yourself that permission, right? So sometimes I think that, just from my own family and experiences, that sometimes people experience certain emotions, and I've heard others actually correct a loved one, like, why are you feeling like that still? And I just always like to say that everyone is unique, and the stages that you experience as a result of grief is always going to be uniquely your own, and that these feelings are normal.
Yeah, right.
And you don't know that they exist either until something actually happens to cause it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And just to add to what you're saying, I think it is really important sometimes just to know that this is normal, right? Yeah. And again, that you may not experience these stages, but that if someone else who is grieving with you is, that is normal, and that it's normal for you to have some of these feelings as well.
Absolutely. So we had mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you know, that again, we're going to have this conversation, you know, around grieving and how COVID has impacted that process. And so when we think about grieving during COVID, you know, there's different ways to think about it. There's kind of that first bucket where if we've experienced a loved one who has passed because of COVID, or someone was lost during COVID, and maybe we couldn't grieve in a way that we had anticipated, or kind of like I think of it as a third bucket, grieving the loss of a relationship. You know, if a loved one is in rehab or a facility right now, you may not be able to visit them like you used to, or even if you're just practicing social distancing and sheltering in place. So can you talk to us a little bit about what grieving during COVID is like, and is it the same as the typical grieving stages, or is there something else that might be a little bit different that kind of complicates it
all? COVID has complicated everything. Don't you think, right? And
yes, so, I think we can all agree to that.
You know, and I think that the grieving process can be so complicated as it is. And so to layer the COVID experience on top of it, it's made it really profound and difficult. There are some silver linings, and I think, you know, we'll have the chance to maybe talk about some of those.
Yep.
But on the whole, I think that especially for caregivers, and especially if we're caring for an elder relative, you know, this is a disease that is very risky for people who are older. And so with that, we've had more loss. I saw a statistic today in terms of the number, the percentage of deaths has been so profoundly more among people over 75 in this country, in the United States, yes. And also overseas. I think that, you know, it's been particularly impacting the loss of those we care for. And so in that way, it has magnified the helplessness that a caregiver can feel, right? So that caregiving, sometimes the role feels out of our control, we're responsive. And so one of the things of losing a relative an older relative that we're caring for to COVID is that it kind of becomes an extension of that sense of helplessness, in that it resulted in this loss. You mentioned the inability to be with loved ones. I was talking again with someone today who was saying that, her 94-year-old mother-in-law has really become housebound, and that they're trying to think of ways to see her, which was part of the conversation. But, it is a loss, not only to not be with people when they're still well, and to feel more isolated from them, but also when they are ill, as you mentioned, not being able to be with them when they're hospitalized or in a facility. And then worst of all, those who've been apart from their loved one when they've passed away. And that's something that many of us really can't imagine, but has happened so much in this pandemic.
Yes.
And finally, I think another very important loss, and something I hope we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about practices and some ways that we maybe can find comfort, is the loss of the rituals. Because I think for many of us, even if we're not particularly religious, we may tend to have rituals that we turn to at times of grief for comfort, for ways of being together and being supported by our family and our friends and our communities. So a lot of that has been curtailed and lost. And I think that has been something people have felt very acutely.
Absolutely. And all of those, loved ones around them, because it's difficult for anyone to process in those circumstances. I mean, this topic is very difficult, to think about what those comfort measures can even possibly be. And especially for those families that lost a loved one and couldn't be there with them, or even host a funeral in the way that they wanted to. It's devastating. So I'm really looking forward to some of the strategies you're sharing, because I think we could all use them, because we've all been impacted by this in one way or another. And so you did mention that, there are paths of finding comfort and meaning relative to grief. And, if there's anyone out there, I'm sure, I recently experienced grief myself. And when it was first happening, there's no silver lining, right? It doesn't feel like you can find that. And then eventually, as time goes on and we speak with people like Dr. Green, who bring such useful strategies, and you start putting them to practice or think about ways in which you can think differently, it really helps to process things. I always like to say that it takes time. So with that being said, can you help us understand, given these circumstances in this topic, exactly how we can find new paths to comfort and meaning while we're grieving?
Yes. And, as I said at the top of the conversation, again, this is not meant to give people, kind of a directive, but more to be something to think about as we talk about these things. And they're really suggestions for ways people have found pathways. Some of them we can use anytime, but, we're going to talk about it just from the perspective of finding that comfort and meaning during this time while we're still dealing with the COVID pandemic. So we're going to talk about 6 different pathways. And the first is acknowledge your loss. Second, establish rituals. Third, create a meaningful memorial. 4, get back to your daily routine. 5, try new things. And 6, seek support. And we'll talk about each of these in detail. So we're going to start with acknowledge your loss. And I saw that, because I could see a little bit of the chat, someone asked about talking about this from the perspective of someone who is older as well. And that's a great point. While we're focusing here on caregiving, it is also true that there are many older adults who've lost their spouse or their sibling, and who also are dealing with the grieving process compounded by their own isolation and concerns about their own health. So I'll try to weave that in as well.
Great, thank you.
The first thing is to really take the time to allow yourself to recognize your sorrow. Sometimes we can be in denial, right? That's one of the stages of grief we talked about. But that sorrow is there. And, you know, in a funny way, of course, that sorrow can be tremendous if it's someone to whom we're very close. But there can also be small things. I lost some of my high school teachers passed away during the pandemic. And I remember feeling so sad, even though these were people who they played a significant role in my life, but it's been a while since I was in high school. You know, that I still needed to sit quietly for a moment and allow myself the chance to acknowledge that this was still a loss. It wasn't a huge loss, right? For me personally, but it was still nonetheless something I felt. So it really, you know, should be something that you allow yourself to acknowledge. Certainly the greatest loss of all, the loss of a close loved one, but also, you know, just going back to some of the things we might be feeling grief about here now during COVID also includes those everyday losses, those, you know, things that we just can't count on in terms of the routine, the inability to visit, and knowing that, you know, you can feel grief to these things, small and large, and that it's okay. The second thing is establishing rituals. And I particularly find rituals very soothing and very meaningful. By a ritual, I mean finding some comforting touchstone that helps you, again, acknowledge the loss, but brings you some comfort. If we look at traditional morning rituals that we have in our religious backgrounds, this is something that is very familiar, right? So whether you, from your tradition, might have a wake or have a sit shiva, there are probably burial rituals that you might turn to, or even just a ritual of being together with family. These are things that have been lost or changed by COVID, and that's been very acutely felt. What we are seeing is innovation around new rituals. And so I would encourage you, even if you lost someone over the past months and it's been some time, if you didn't have a way of doing something such as gathering people together, it's never, ever too late to do that. And there's been a lot of innovation around online gatherings like we're doing here, to mourn together. And in some parts of the country, and I'm not as familiar with Ontario and Canada, what the regulations and restrictions are there, you might be able to even gather outside at a distance in a small group, to, you know, be together and to have some kind of memorial service if you weren't able to previously. So I would look for ways of having some ritual, because it can be very soothing to have that ritual. You can also make ritual part of your routine. So for example, in some traditions, you'll place stones when you visit a grave site. And if you're not able to visit the grave site, you can still pick up stones and create a little stack of stones for yourself, right? Where you maybe look for a stone and add it each week as part of a comforting ritual. And look to work together to make these familiar rituals happen, as I just said, in terms of, say, an outdoor distance gathering, maybe for a memorial, and other ways to create your own rituals. That can be a very personal thing. It might be looking outside and greeting the day, and, you know, knowing that your loved one would have just been with you and loved doing that with you, and remembering their spirit in that way. So just some ideas, but more, I think the message here is to look for some way to have ritual, to acknowledge the loss, to acknowledge the memory of your loved one, and to use that in a way that brings you comfort.
And I'm so glad you shared some of these things, and they're really beautiful, you know, because we are used to a traditional way of mourning, like you mentioned, that's been compromised during COVID. And, you know, just finding a way to mourn with others that's still in a safe environment. Like you said, outdoor, I've attended outdoor funerals. You know, it was different. But I can't express how important it was to be together in that way, just to see people that loved your individual who passed maybe just as much as you did, or at least knew them and could offer something to you that could sort of uplift you, and you could all sort of uplift each other through that process. So
Yeah.
we have to just kind of give ourselves permission that this is kind of the new normal, and try to find a way to get through it in some way by creating these new rituals. So thank you so much for sharing this. I think this is really useful. You have another suggestion.
So this is to create a meaningful memorial. And this really talks about ways to honor your loved one and their memory. And, you know, there's so many different ways to do this. And it does overlap a little bit with the idea of establishing a ritual. But whereas the ritual is something that is, you know, kind of either a set aside, like a service, or something that you might do personally on a regular basis to remember your individual. This is something where it is, you know, more of a way of honoring their memory by doing something, maybe like giving to a meaningful cause that they might have wanted you to support, or doing a walk, like like a fundraising walk. A lot of those are happening online. Our local Alzheimer's Association chapter just held their walk virtually, so people walked on their own, but still raised money for the organization. So you can do something like that in their memory, or you can create a personal memorial, something that's more meaningful and reflects them or their relationship with you. You can plant a special garden, or I mentioned the stacking the rocks. I guess you can tell I like that idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to say, so just in terms of also the individual who raised the question about helping older relatives cope with their own loss, you know, things like creating a regular opportunity to share stories, or creating a book of stories with them. You know, let them tell you stories, and create the memorial. Might be a book of stories about the person who was lost, that can be passed down, or establish a time to talk to younger members of the family about the individual, so that their memory becomes kind of woven into the fabric of the family. Those are another kind of more personal ways that we can create a memorial.
And it's interesting that you bring up seeking out stories, because when I had a loved one who passed, the first thing that I needed to hear from others were stories about this person. And so I immediately began reaching out to cousins and aunts, and was like, okay, tell me about this time, or, you know, there was a story I just needed to hear again. And it can be so comforting. So, you know, even if, you know, you're interested in creating a meaningful memorial, or creating one of these audiobooks, which is amazing. There's a lot of great resources out there. Even just calling others to get those stories and gather them, even if you jotted them down yourself and put it in a journal, it could be so helpful. I'm going to tell you, I did it myself, and it really helped. And still.
And if you're tech savvy, there's also video programs where everyone can record a short video, and they'll compile them, so it becomes that kind of meaningful memorial that can be wonderful to go back and look at, you know, several years down the road. There might be children or grandchildren who are too young to remember somebody, but those stories can bring them to life.
Agreed.
So our next kind of suggestion is to get back to your daily routine. And this can be very difficult, and it can sound a little critical, right? You don't want someone to tell you to get back to your daily routine. But one of the things we can do to help ourselves in the grieving process is by looking eventually, and I'm not saying right away, but eventually, to kind of get back to a routine. Grieving is disruptive to our routine, and it should be. And we should set aside the time to grieve. But we do eventually, as we help ourselves cope and heal, and we work towards that kind of process of acceptance, of weaving the loss into our lives, we need to reestablish our routine. It can be a wonderful way to get ourselves back kind of into kind of a more settled sense of self, and also can be distracting. Clearly right now that can be more difficult due to physically distancing. So if part of your routine was going to an office, and you might have had the kind of ease of distraction from being quite busy at work, you might not have that now. You might not be working, you might be working from home, so that you can't really escape in that same way. But look for ways to return to that daily routine, even with those limitations. Set a schedule for yourself, and just try as much as possible to get into some routine. Maybe the break that you will do is taking a walk in the middle of the day as a way of getting out and kind of getting away. But whatever it is, that routine can really be helpful to help us reset.
Yes. Yeah. And eventually you'll get there. I feel like during the grieving process, it impacts everybody differently. And eventually you will get there, and it might not be so easy in the beginning either, but to make sure you give yourself that time. And then I think, moving along is helpful.
Right. There's no timeline.
There isn't.
Right.
No.
Everyone has to find their timeline.
That's right.
But these are some things that can help you along that go, kind of move along the path of grief. So the other thing is to try new things. So one of the things that can also be helpful is distraction. And sometimes something that's new can be more distracting. It takes more of our cognitive energy, if you will, when we're learning something new. And so it can be an idea to start a new hobby or a health goal, to explore something you've always been curious about right now, because it can be a way of filling your time with something that is positive and distracting. And then finally, and this is something that I hope those of you, especially who are having a difficult time with the grieving process, may be more difficult than you anticipated, will kind of think about, which is seeking support. It can be very difficult to cope with grief on our own under normal circumstances. And the isolation many of us are feeling right now, coupled with the complications around the loss of our loved one during this period of time, can really magnify all of that. And even though you may not be able to physically be with your friends and family in the way that you would like to have been, I encourage you to really seek their support. Sometimes you have to let people know that you're having a hard time if they're not with you on a regular basis, and that's okay. And you can be sure that you build in ways to be with them if you can't be with them in person, to be together on video calls like this, to check in with that older relative who may have had a loss during this time, so you can make sure you're available to them and find comfort together. If you're still having a hard time, and there is something we call complicated grief, where grief, the process of grieving is prolonged, and some of the things that happen, such as feeling anxious or feeling sad, become kind of overwhelming, and over a period of time don't diminish and start to interfere with our ability to function and take care of ourselves and be wholly ourselves, then I would really suggest talking to a trained counselor. And that can be a psychologist or a social worker. It could be a religious advisor, but that kind of person can be a sounding board who can really be helpful in your healing process, especially if you're having difficulty with the grieving process over a longer period of time. So in closing, and before we move to the questions, just to turn it back to you, I encourage you to think about what will help. So again, this is not that these things are for everybody,
Mhm.
and that they are not kind of directives, but more suggestions. And hopefully there's some ideas in here that may help you. They may help someone that you're caring for who is grieving, or friends or family who you know are having a hard time and you want to share the information. So we talked about acknowledging your loss, establishing rituals, creating a meaningful memorial for yourself, getting back to your daily routine, trying new things. And if over time it becomes clear that the grief process is not progressing towards a resolution, and kind of a sense of it weaving into your daily, kind of daily life, to think about seeking support.
All right, that's really helpful. And, thank you, Dr. Green. And, the other aspect of support is what in-home care can also look like and offer. Um, you know, Dr. Green just shared 16 wonderful comfort measures that we can consider that can help us through the grieving process. And some of you are also caring for someone who needs you. As a caregiver, there are people that count on us to be our best and to provide support. And when we're going through grieving, we're not always at our best, and that's okay. And that's where in-home care, we always like to say that services are not just for clients, but they're for the family members and that support system that supports that individual on a daily basis. So I like to think of when we are caring for someone, it's kind of like a team sport. And I always say, find your teammates and know that in-home care can be really supportive and assist you and others that might be going through that grieving process, that may need to care for an older adult, to give yourself time. They're flexible services. They can be short-term or long-term. But ultimately what they're doing, and what our goal is as a provider with ComForCare and At Your Side Home Care, is to provide that in-home assistance that provides support, keeps your loved one at home safe, and gives you a little bit of a break for respite care, to even if it's just to go out on that walk, or if you want to visit where your loved one used to live, or to a cemetery, whatever you would like to do, that means it gives you time knowing that someone is caring for that individual in their home. So we always like to, encourage those of you that aren't really familiar with in-home care or have been considering it, to give us a call. Know that we're your partner in care in these unusual times, and we can be that sounding board, and we can help provide you that support and kind of walk you through your care journey. Some of you may also be considering looking at what community care looks like for your loved one. Maybe you did experience loss of a loved one, and there's someone still counting on you. And maybe that transition has left you questioning, what's going to be the best transition for the individual you support and care for. And maybe community living is the right option. And so that's where our sister company, Care Patrol, comes in, that can assist in helping families and individuals understand what's available in your community. What's the difference between an independent versus an assisted living? Which ones are available that might serve your particular needs best. And I'll even take you out on virtual tours, help you understand what's available, and really be your partner in care too. So in terms of services and support, we just want to make sure that you know that we're here in your communities across the country and in Canada, and we can support you every step of the way. I want to remind everyone before we go ahead and take questions, I see that there's a few questions that are coming in that we'll try to get to, that we have one more webinar coming up. It's next Thursday, same time, 7:30. And this is to talk about caring from a distance, which a lot of us, especially now, just family dynamics have changed. A lot of us are caring for loved ones a couple, 2, 3, 4 hours or states away. And that can kind of put another different type of stress, right? Not knowing if mom or dad is okay. So we're going to walk through that and what that means, and also give you some helpful strategies. So we'll take the same approach, sort of a conversational webinar, where you'll hear Dr. Cynthia and I, Dr. Green and I talk about some strategies relative to these very difficult topics. So let's see here. We have a few minutes for some questions. Dr. Green, I did see one, and I wanted to bring it up because I experienced it myself. So sometimes when a loved one passes, family dynamics can be stressed, let's say. Everyone is grieving, and so it's a challenging time. And so the family dynamics can be strained. Any recommendations on how to work with others that may see things differently from you?
There's a saying that someone once, told me. I can't remember how it exactly goes, but funerals don't always bring out the best in all of us, right? We don't always grieve in the same way. The loss, especially in a family, can bring up past feelings, things that happened in the past, senses of inequity, for example, and it can be a very difficult time. So I think that one of the things to do is to try to set a kind of understanding of respect. That can be easier said than done. And sometimes you may feel disrespected and want to respond in kind, but at least starting out with a sense of, saying this is kind of like a safe space for all of us. We can express our feelings and we can kind of talk about how we feel, but in a way that's respectful to all of us and to each other's views. The other thing that can be, I think, helpful is to maybe try to divide and conquer, right? Because sometimes what happens, and it happens with caregiving too, right, Stephanie?
Yeah.
There's a lot of maybe overlap and people don't always agree on how to proceed with something. But sometimes assigning roles can diminish the conflict and can, you may not agree with how someone does something, but as long as they get it done and they get it done in a way that is safe for everybody, that can be something that you can let go of then, and that everyone can have a role, so that can diminish that overlap and conflict.
I'm with you, and I think that's a great approach. And when we work with families, different family dynamics, and even trying to start care, a lot of family members just come to the conclusion that they just have differences of opinions, and a lot of it is because they care for that individual, and there's a lot of stress associated with a life transition. And one thing that we always like to share with families too is using the right opening statements. So we put things back on ourselves, or ask, well, how does that make you feel, and what would you like to do? More open-ended rather than directive can also help in the conversation.
Yes, and you can talk about how you feel, but not
how they feel.
Presume how someone else feels. There's a lot. It's a very fraught situation, like caregiving, right? The loss of somebody, and so and I think also encouraging everyone to focus on the positive. So not on old grievances, not on things that happen, but kind of like things where there's commonality around memories or shared experiences, and kind of around the process in terms of moving forward.
That's right.
Great question though.
It is. And it's important. And one last question is, there are some people obviously that have just a hard time getting back into that routine. So any tips on that? Like you had mentioned that grieving, there is no timeline, but unfortunately some of us have to go back to work. And so it kind of speeds that up. So that's a really difficult transition when you have to go back to work that first week, especially. Any tips on how to make it a little bit easier?
So it's so hard. And that is one of those things where you have to go through your own timeline, right? You don't want it to be extended for such a long period of time that it really interferes with your own living. But you do need to allow the grief to process. And if you have to go back to work, or even if you're not going back to work, you might have, children that you have to take care of, someone else who's older that you're taking care of. So it's not like your life can stop. So one of the things that I would suggest is finding time, even carving out a few minutes while you have your coffee in the morning. Get up 5 minutes earlier so you can sit with your coffee or your tea, or sit outside and welcome the morning. So you have a little time to acknowledge and check in with yourself around the grief process. that can be your ritual, right? Where
Yep.
you can kind of check in with your memories of your loved one, or something that you miss about them that day, or something that that they would have appreciated about that moment. So that you have that ritual of time that you do kind of take care of yourself, even though it might be limited to that. At least you have that in
Right.
your day, and that can help you process.
I think that's a great suggestion. Well, again, thanks to everybody for attending. Again, Dr. Green, thank you as always for your
Thank you.
insight and for bringing your depth of knowledge on this topic and expertise and experience. It's been very helpful. Those of you on the line, we are here to help, to support you, even if you need a sounding board. You can always give any of our offices a call. We hear you, we see you, and we just want to support you. Thanks to all of you. Like I mentioned, we have one more conversational webinar coming up next Thursday. And if there's anything you need, please feel free to reach out. Again, thanks to everybody. And we will hopefully hear from you soon. And good luck to all of you in your circumstances. And hope you do find some comfort in some of the strategies we shared this evening.